The sound echoed across the rooftop before anyone could process what had just happened. A slap. Loud. Sharp. Public. Jade, a brilliant, self-made black woman in a crimson dress who had built an empire from nothing, stood frozen on a luxury Manhattan rooftop, 41 floors above the city she had conquered, her hand rising slowly to her cheek. The man who had struck her was her ex-husband, Bradley Whitmore III. Blonde, blue-eyed, old money. The kind of man who had spent his entire life believing that his name made him untouchable, that his wealth made him invincible, that a woman like Jade would never truly be beyond his reach. He was smiling. He had done it, in front of everyone. The champagne, the chandeliers, the carefully dressed witnesses with their phones already in their hands. He thought he had won something. He thought this was the final word. He had never been more wrong in his life. Because what Bradley Whitmore III did not know, what he could not have possibly prepared himself for, was that somewhere on the other side of those floor-to-ceiling windows, a man in a black suit had already stopped moving. A man with tattoos rising up his neck like a warning written in another language. A man whose name made entire financial empires reroute their plans. A man who ran the most feared criminal organization in Seoul, and who had just watched someone he protected get struck in public. Kwon Suk-jin set down his glass, and he began to walk. Brad thought the worst thing that could happen to him that night had already happened to someone else. He had no idea that by morning, his entire world would begin to quietly, permanently, and invisibly collapse. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a member and help our channel. There are rooms in this world that do not exist on any map, and yet everyone who matters knows exactly where they are. The rooftop of the Arca Hotel on a Thursday evening in late October was one of those rooms. 41 floors above the street, above the noise, above the ordinary machinery of the city grinding through its nightly rotations, it floated like something separate from consequence. A space where the people who made decisions that affected millions of other people could pretend, for a few hours, that decisions had no weight at all. The air up there smelled of catered ambition, of champagne poured too carefully, of cologne that cost more than most people's rent, and perfume that had been designed in Paris for the specific purpose of making whoever wore it seem like they had always belonged exactly where they were standing. The Metropolitan Arts Foundation Gala was not the most important event of the season. It was not the most exclusive, but it had, over the course of 11 years, become something that the most important and exclusive events rarely managed to become. It had become the room where people went when they wanted to be seen by the right people, without the pressure of being evaluated too seriously. It was, in the private language of Manhattan's upper circles, a comfortable room. A room where guards came down just slightly, where the second glass of champagne became a third without anyone keeping count. Which made it, for people who understood the value of lowered guards, an extraordinarily useful room. Jade Simone Carter understood this. She had been attending events like this one for 6 years. First as a guest of her then-husband, invisible beside him in the way that certain women are made invisible, not by force, but by the quiet, relentless gravity of a man who needs to be the only sun in his solar system. And then, after the divorce, on her own name, on her own invitation, on her own terms. She had watched the subtle shift happen over those 6 years. the way people's eyes moved when she entered a space. First, they looked at her with the polite curiosity reserved for attractive women at wealthy events. Then they began to look with recognition. Then with the particular quality of attention that people reserve for someone whose name has begun to carry weight. She was 10 minutes late. This was not an accident. She had learned in those 6 years that timing in a room like this was its own language. Arriving first meant eagerness. Arriving precisely on time meant corporate obligation. But arriving 10 minutes after the room had filled, after conversations had begun and champagne had been poured and people were already searching for something interesting to look at, that was the arrival that landed. And it landed. The elevator doors opened and she stepped into the amber warmth of the rooftop, and something in the air changed in the way that air changes when a pressure system shifts. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the undeniable physical reality of something new entering a space. The crimson of her dress was the only true red in the room. Not burgundy, not wine, not the careful approximation of red that people choose when they want to gesture toward boldness without committing to it. Red, arterial and certain. The silk moved with her in a way that made it look like the fabric had been convinced rather than tailored. The gold of her clutch caught the light from the chandeliers overhead. The gold of her stilettos caught the light from the city below. She said hello to 3 people by name on the way to the terrace, declined champagne with a smile that communicated absolutely no apology, found her position at the edge of the glass railing with the Hudson dark and glittering 41 floors beneath her, and felt, as she always felt in these first minutes of arrival, the particular satisfaction of a woman who had built something real, standing inside a space that had once tried to make her feel like she didn't belong. She had been standing there for less than 4 minutes when she heard the voice. She knew it before she turned around. The human body, it turns out, stores certain sounds in places that have nothing to do with memory, places deeper than thought, closer to reflex. Bradley Whitmore III's voice lived in one of those places in Jade Carter's body. Not because she loved him. She had stopped being certain she ever did. But because she had spent 4 years in a state of low-grade vigilance around that voice, listening for its changes in register, for the specific tonal shift that meant the evening was going to require management, for the particular cadence that preceded a comment made in public that was designed to seem casual and land like a bruise. She turned around. He was leaning against the glass railing 15 feet away, positioned in exactly the way that men who have had money their entire lives lean against things, as though the surface beneath them exists for their convenience. The gray of his suit was expensive in the way that gray suits are expensive when someone has paid to make them look effortless. The first 2 buttons of his shirt were open. The Rolex on his wrist caught the light. He was holding a glass of whiskey in the hand closest to her, and he had the expression that she had come to think of as his social face, the one that smiled with the mouth while the eyes did something else entirely. Jade Carter. He said it like he was confirming a sighting, like he was naming something he had spotted from a distance and waited to verify up close. Bradley. She said his name the way you say the name of something you have already moved past. The conversation that followed was brief and traveled the predictable geography of conversations between people who share a painful history and have chosen different ways of carrying it. He was performing ease. She was performing neutrality. Neither performance was entirely convincing to the other, but both were sufficient for the 40 seconds it took to exhaust the social obligation of acknowledging each other's presence. She turned to leave. What happened next lasted less than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds contained everything. Every assumption Bradley Whitmore III had made about his place in the world. Every calculation he had run about what he could say and do and to whom. Every year of inherited certainty that his name and his money and his face made him untouchable in rooms like this one. His voice rose. Not a shout. Something worse. The deliberate, carrying projection of a man who wanted specific people to hear him while maintaining the plausible architecture of a private comment. The words came out dressed as observation. The kind of thing a man says when he wants maximum damage with minimum accountability. He talked about her new relationship. He used the word yakuza, the way people use slurs when they want the violence of the word without the visibility of the intention. He said something about a fall in standards. He said something about what she was. Jade stopped walking. 1, 2, 3. The reflex. The 3-second freeze that 4 years of living inside his emotional weather system had installed in her body like a circuit breaker. She had spent 2 years in therapy understanding that reflex, understanding that it was not weakness, that it was, in fact, the nervous system of a deeply intelligent woman doing exactly what it had been trained to do by a man who had benefited from her managed responses. She turned. She told him, quietly, to stop. He did not stop. And then his hand moved. The sound of it crossed the terrace before anyone had time to process what they were seeing. A flat, sharp sound. The kind that doesn't echo so much as it continues, living in the air longer than physics should allow. The kind of sound that a room full of carefully managed people hears and then immediately looks away from. Because looking directly at it means deciding what to do about it. And deciding what to do about it means choosing a side. Jade stood completely still. She was not trembling. This was the thing that would stay with everyone who witnessed it and was honest enough to describe it afterward. She was not trembling. Her spine was straight. Her chin was level. One hand had moved involuntarily to the cheek he had struck, and it rested there for exactly 1 moment before she lowered it deliberately, with the kind of control that is not composure, but something older and harder than composure. On the other side of the saloon's floor-to-ceiling windows, 30 feet away, a man in a black suit set his glass on the tray of a passing waiter. He did it without looking at the waiter, without looking at the glass. His eyes had already traveled through the glass partition, already found what they were looking for, already completed the assessment that his mind ran automatically in situations that crossed the single threshold he had maintained without exception for 11 years. Kwon Suk-jin began to walk. And what no one in that room, not the guests with their champagne and their careful smiles, not the waitstaff with their trays and their practiced invisibility, not Bradley Whitmore III with his whiskey and his inherited certainty. What none of them understood yet was this. The evening had already ended. They simply hadn't been told. There is a particular kind of silence that has nothing to do with the absence of sound. The terrace was not quiet. The string quartet inside was still playing, something by Ravel, delicate and unhurried, completely indifferent to what had just occurred 40 feet away. Conversations had resumed in the saloon. Glasses were still being filled. The machinery of the event continued its rotation with the practiced resilience of expensive gatherings that have learned, over decades of hosted human drama, that the show does not stop for the private catastrophes of the people inside it. But on the terrace, in the specific geography of air surrounding Jade Carter and Bradley Whitmore III, there was that other kind of silence. The kind that forms when everyone present understands that something has crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. and the understanding sits in the body before it reaches the mind, and the body's response is to go very still and wait. 3 people on the terrace had their phones in their hands. 2 of them had already begun recording before they fully understood why. Brad was doing what Brad always did in the seconds immediately following one of his escalations: recalibrating. It was a process Jade had watched so many times during their marriage that she could map it with her eyes closed. First came the flash of something that resembled satisfaction, the brief neurological reward of having expressed what had been building. Then came the rapid environmental scan. Who was watching? Who mattered? What was the social cost? Could it be managed? Then came the version of the event that he would carry forward, already being constructed in real time, in which his actions were responses rather than initiations, provocations rather than attacks, understandable rather than inexcusable. She watched him run this process now, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not anger. Not the frozen dread that had defined so many moments inside their marriage. Not even the cold clarity that came after the dread, in the long hours when she would sit with the reality of what her life had become and make quiet, incremental decisions about how to exit it. What she felt, standing on that terrace with her cheek still carrying the warmth of impact, was a kind of enormous, exhausted calm. The calm of a woman who had already survived the worst version of this man and knew, with cellular certainty, that she was no longer inside his reach. That whatever he had just done, whatever architecture of justification he was currently building inside that expensive skull of his, it no longer had the power to define anything about her. She was thinking this, standing in her crimson dress with her spine straight and her hand lowered and her eyes on him with an expression he had never been able to correctly read, when the quality of the terrace changed. It was subtle, the way the pressure in a room changes when a door opens somewhere else in a building. Not felt exactly, but registered. A slight reorganization of the air. A shift in where people's attention was orienting. Not with drama, not with sudden movement, but with the slow, collective redirect of a group of people who have become, without quite deciding to, aware of a new presence. Brad felt it before he saw it. He saw it in Jade's eyes first. Not fear, not relief exactly, but a settling, as though something had clicked into its correct position. And then he heard the sound that the crowd makes when it parts, not because it has been told to, but because something in the shared animal circuitry of a group of human beings says, without language, "Make room." He turned. Kwon Suk-jin was 8 feet away and closing. Brad's mind, in this moment, did what underprepared minds do when they encounter something they have no existing framework for. It reached for the nearest available category. The nearest available category was wealthy Asian businessman, probably a client of someone here, probably harmless, probably stoppable with the right combination of social confidence and Anglo-Saxon projection. This categorization was the last significant mistake of Bradley Whitmore III's comfortable life. Suk-jin stopped at a distance that was not close enough to be physical, but was close enough to be absolute. He was taller than Brad had initially registered, the kind of tall that doesn't announce itself from across a room, but becomes undeniable at close range. The black of his suit absorbed the terrace lighting rather than reflecting it, so that he seemed to exist in slightly sharper contrast to the world around him than physics strictly explained. The tattoos at his neck were visible above the collar, not the decorative ink of a man performing rebellion, but the deliberate markings of a man who had, at some point in his life, decided that the thing he was no longer needed to hide what it was. His eyes moved to Jade first. This was the detail that people who witnessed it would return to afterward. That he looked at her first. Not at Brad. Not at the gathered witnesses. At her. And the look was not possessive, not performative, not the look of a man asserting territorial claim over a woman. It was the look of someone running a rapid and genuine assessment of another person's condition. A look that asked a question without any of the theater of asking. She answered it with a single word and the set of her jaw. Only then did his eyes move to Brad. And Brad, who had spent 38 years in rooms where his name or his face or the cut of his suit was sufficient to establish his position in any given social hierarchy, understood in the space of a single second that none of those things were functioning correctly in this particular moment. That the coordinates he used to navigate the world, wealth, race, accent, confidence, the specific social grammar of American old money, were not being read by the man in front of him in the way they were always read. Were not, perhaps, being read at all. You are Brad. The voice was even, unhurried, accented in a way that was slight enough to be almost absent, present enough to remind you that this man existed in a world much larger than the one you were standing in. Brad opened his mouth. The social reflex kicked in. The name, the family name, the handshake of the entitled. Bradley Whitmore. Whitmore. The repetition of his own surname in another man's mouth had never felt like this before. It felt like a file being opened, like something being confirmed against a record that already existed. What followed was not a confrontation in any of the ways that Brad had ever experienced confrontation. There was no raised voice. There was no physical posturing. There was no performance of aggression designed to establish dominance in front of witnesses. What there was, instead, was information. Delivered in a calm, measured conversational register that made it significantly more terrifying than any of the alternatives. The hotel where Brad was staying. The fund that was losing. The negotiation that was stalling. The dinner reservations. The conversations. The names. Each item delivered not as a threat, but as a demonstration. A controlled reveal of the size of a file that Brad had not known existed. Offered without explanation and without any explicit statement of what its existence implied. The implication was available for Brad to assemble himself, and Brad, to his credit, assembled it quickly. "I suggest," Suk-jin said, and the word suggest landed in the air between them with the specific weight of a word that means its opposite. "That you apologize to Jade. Now. In front of every person on this terrace." Brad's mouth opened. "I suggest..." And here, Suk-jin took one step forward, a single step, unhurried and geometrically precise. "That after that, you leave. And that you spend whatever time you have left in this city, and in whatever cities come after it, conducting yourself as though this evening never occurred." "You can't..." Brad started. "I haven't finished." 4 words. The silence around them thickened. "You struck her." A pause, brief and total, like the pause before a door closes. "In public. With witnesses." I want you to hold that fact in your mind for a moment. And I want you to consider, very carefully, what happens to men who make that choice with women who are connected to me. And then I want you to decide whether you believe I am the kind of man who exaggerates. Bradley Whitmore III stood on a rooftop 41 floors above Manhattan with a Rolex on his wrist and 11 figures of inherited net worth in accounts he had never had to work to fill. And he made the only accurate assessment of his situation that he had made in recent memory. He turned to Jade. The whiskey glass was trembling slightly in his grip. His voice, when it came, had lost something that it had carried for the entirety of their marriage. The particular frequency of a man who believes, without examination, that his comfort is the room's primary concern. Jade? A pause. I'm sorry. She looked at him for a long moment, not with satisfaction, not with the performative triumph of a woman who has waited for this moment and rehearsed her response to it. With something quieter than that. With the expression of someone who has already done the work of surviving a person and is now simply observing the final, small confirmation that they were right to leave. I know, she said. She turned. She placed her hand on Seokjin's arm, not dramatically, not for the audience, but with the ease of a woman touching something she trusted. And they walked back into the warmth of the saloon together, and the crowd that had parted to let him through closed gently behind them, and Bradley Whitmore III was left standing alone on the terrace with his cooling whiskey and the dawning comprehension of a man who has just understood, too late, the difference between being powerful and being protected. The thing about a room full of wealthy people is that they are, above all else, students of survival. Not survival in the raw, physical sense, not the survival of cold winters and scarce food and genuine danger, but survival in the specific, refined sense of people who have learned, over generations of careful social navigation, that the most important skill in any room is knowing which way the wind is blowing before anyone else does. Knowing when something has shifted. Knowing when a name that was said with respect last Thursday should be said with slightly less enthusiasm this Thursday, and with careful omission by the following week. The terrace of the Arca Hotel had watched Bradley Whitmore III make his exit. Not dramatically, not escorted, but with the particular quality of departure that communicates more than any dramatic removal could. He had put down his glass on the nearest surface. He had straightened his jacket with the mechanical precision of a man performing composure for an audience that had already stopped pretending not to watch. He had walked to the elevator with even steps, pressed the button, waited the 11 seconds it took for the doors to open, and stepped inside. The doors had closed, and the room had done what the room always does. It had turned back to itself, resumed its conversations, refilled its glasses, and begun the quiet, efficient process of deciding what that had been and what it meant and what the correct relationship to it was going forward. By the time Jade and Seokjin had moved from the terrace into the main saloon, the assessment was already circulating through the gathering in the invisible, rapid way that assessments circulate in rooms like this one. Through eye contact and slight adjustments in body language, and the specific warmth or coolness with which certain names were subsequently spoken. People who had greeted Brad by his first name earlier in the evening found themselves unable to recall, with confidence, exactly how well they knew him. People who had not previously introduced themselves to Jade Carter began finding reasons to move in her direction. This was not cruelty. It was gravity. The social gravity of a room full of people who understood, instinctively and without requiring explicit confirmation, that the coordinates of this particular evening had shifted, and that their own positions needed to be recalibrated accordingly. Jade understood what was happening. She had watched these calculations run in these rooms enough times to read them as fluently as text. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and stood beside Seokjin near the east window, where the skyline spread itself out in the particular way that the Manhattan skyline behaves when you were looking at it from high enough. Not as backdrop, but as evidence. Evidence of scale, of density, of the extraordinary amount of human intention that had been stacked over a century and a half into this narrow strip of island. You didn't have to say all of that, she said, not looking at him. Her voice was low beneath the ambient sound of the room. I know, he said. The financial details, the hotel, the fund. Yes. That was deliberate. Everything I do is deliberate. She turned to look at him then. This was the thing about Kwon Suk-jin that she had understood early and continued to find simultaneously comforting and unsettling. He did not perform. Most men in his position, men who carried the kind of weight he carried and moved in the kind of circles he moved in, had developed elaborate performances of themselves. Performances of power, of nonchalance, of dangerous unpredictability. The performance was part of the apparatus, a layer of theater that kept people slightly off balance, slightly uncertain, unable to read the actual terrain. Suk-jin had no performance. What he presented was simply what was there, and what was there was sufficient enough that no augmentation was required. This was, she had come to understand, the most refined expression of genuine power. The kind that has been so thoroughly internalized that it no longer needs to be demonstrated. How long have you had a file on him? She asked. A pause. Not hesitation. He didn't hesitate. A pause of the kind that precedes honesty. Since before you told me about the marriage. Jade was quiet for a moment. That's... She started. Thorough, he offered. I was going to say unsettling. It can be both. She looked back at the skyline. Somewhere far below, 41 floors down, the ordinary city was doing its ordinary things. Taxis and delivery trucks, and people walking fast in coats that weren't quite warm enough for October. People who had no idea that 11 minutes ago, on a rooftop they would never visit, something had begun that would end a man's comfortable life by degrees so precise and so unmarked that he would never be entirely certain it had been done to him at all. He's going to think it ends tonight, she said. Most people think the thing they can see is the whole thing. And they're wrong. Almost always. There was nothing in his voice when he said it that she could identify as satisfaction. This was another quality she had learned to recognize in him. The complete absence of enjoyment in outcomes that another man would have savored. He was not a man who took pleasure in the mechanics of consequence. He simply ensured that consequences were proportionate, and then moved his attention to the next thing. The absence of theatrical relish was, she had come to understand, more frightening than its presence would have been. Inside the saloon, the string quartet had shifted to something else. Debussy now. Lighter and more liquid, filling the space between conversations with something that asked nothing of the people beneath it. The amphitriao of the evening, a silver-haired man named Harrington, who had been running this gala for 9 of its 11 years, appeared at Jade's left with the practiced warmth of a man whose primary professional skill was making everyone in a room feel specifically and individually attended to. He greeted her with genuine pleasure, the kind that had grown over the years from polite industry courtesy into something that resembled actual regard. He greeted Suk-jin with the particular quality of deference that people who are very good at reading rooms extend to people they have correctly identified as the most significant presence in them. They spoke for several minutes about the Foundation's new acquisitions program, about a sculptor Jade's agency had recently represented, about the expansion of the Arca brand into Singapore and Dubai. A fact Harrington mentioned without appearing to notice that he was mentioning it to the man who owned the Arca brand. When Harrington moved on, Jade allowed herself a small, private moment of appreciation for the absurdity of the evening. "He knows who you are," she said. "Most people in this room do." And Brad didn't. Brad knew my name. He didn't know what it meant. There's a difference. There is always a difference, Sukjin said, between knowing a name and understanding what stands behind it. The evening continued. This was the thing that struck Jade later, when she replayed the hours in the quiet of the following morning. How thoroughly the event had continued. How the champagne had kept flowing, and the music had kept playing, and the conversations had kept their surface brightness, even as something irreversible had occurred in the geography of one man's life. The world does not pause for private catastrophes. It simply continues, and the catastrophe happens inside the continuation, invisible to everyone not directly involved. She stayed another hour. She spoke to 3 clients, made 1 introduction that she had been planning for 6 weeks, and declined 2 invitations to after-parties with the particular warmth that leaves people feeling pleased to have been asked rather than rejected. She was good at this, had always been good at this. The craft of moving through a professional landscape with enough grace that the landscape itself began to feel like home. When they left, it was without announcement and without the kind of exit that calls attention to itself. The elevator, the lobby, the night air of 57th Street arriving cold and clean after the careful warmth of the rooftop. The town car was waiting. The door was opened. Before she got in, she stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, looked up. Not at the building, not at the rooftop 41 floors above her, but at the sky beyond it. The sky over Manhattan is never dark. It is a deep amber gray, lit from below by 10 million lights, holding the stars hostage behind its glow. She breathed. "Are you all right?" Sukjin asked. Not Gwenchana this time. English. Deliberate. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I have been all right for a long time," she said. "Tonight just reminded me of it." She got into the car. He followed. And 41 floors above them, on a terrace that was now being cleared by staff in white gloves, a whiskey glass sat abandoned on a ledge, still holding the faint circular impression of a hand that had gripped it too tightly. While somewhere across the city, in a hotel room on the 57th Street corridor, Bradley Whitmore III sat on the edge of a bed in a suit that had cost $4,000 and tried to locate, inside the machinery of his own certainty, the exact moment when the evening had stopped belonging to him. He could not find it. That was, of course, precisely the point. The morning after is always its own kind of reckoning. Not the dramatic, immediate reckoning of consequence arriving at the door with its hand raised, but the quieter, more insidious reckoning of a man sitting alone in a room that costs $800 a night, in a suit he slept in because he never quite made it to the bed properly, watching the gray light of a Manhattan October morning press itself against the window glass, and understanding, with a clarity that the whiskey of the previous evening had temporarily obscured, that something had changed in the architecture of his life, and he could not yet see the full shape of the change. Bradley Whitmore III was not by nature an introspective man. Introspection requires a willingness to examine one's own foundations, and Brad's foundations had never required examination, because they had never, in 38 years of continuous use, shown any sign of instability. He had been born into a world that confirmed him at every turn, confirmed his judgments, his appetites, his casual cruelties, his reflexive assumption that the spaces he occupied existed for his comfort, and that the people in those spaces existed, in various supporting capacities, for his convenience. This confirmation had come from everywhere and from everyone. From his father, who had taught him that a Whitmore name opened doors that other men spent lifetimes trying to find. From his schools, which had taken his mediocrity and dressed it in the vocabulary of potential. From his social circles, which had mistaken his confidence for intelligence and his inheritance for achievement. From his marriage, which had given him, for 4 years, a woman whose actual brilliance he had spent those same 4 years methodically attempting to convince her she didn't possess. Because a man who needs to be the brightest thing in the room must first ensure that nothing else in the room is allowed to shine. He sat at the window of the Meridian Hotel and thought about the man in the black suit. He thought about the information that had been delivered in that quiet, unhurried voice. The hotel, the fund, the negotiation. He had run the question through his mind perhaps 40 times since the elevator doors had closed behind him the previous evening. How? How had a Korean businessman known the specifics of his financial position, his current negotiations, his accommodation, his dinner reservations? It was the kind of information that lived in emails, in phone calls, in private meetings with advisors who had signed confidentiality agreements. The question itself was the answer, but Brad was not yet ready to receive it. He called his financial advisor at 7:43 in the morning. The call went to voicemail. He called again at 7:51. Voicemail again. This was unusual. Marcus had been available at any hour for 11 years, a fact that Brad had always accepted as simply the natural order of things, the way assistants are available, the way staff is available, the way the world orients itself around the needs of men whose accounts justify that orientation. He sent a text, then another. He opened his laptop and pulled up the dashboard for the Hargrove Fund account. The numbers he found there were the numbers he already knew. Down 34%, a fact that had been presented to him 3 weeks ago as a temporary correction, a cyclical adjustment, nothing that required immediate alarm. He stared at the numbers now with a different quality of attention than he had given them 3 weeks ago. Because 3 weeks ago, they had been private information. And now they had been spoken aloud by a stranger on a rooftop in a voice that carried no more emotional weight than a man reading coordinates from a map. The Delacroix negotiation was scheduled for a call at noon. He opened his email to confirm the details. There was a message from the Delacroix legal team. It had arrived at 11:47 the previous night, less than 2 hours after he had left the Arca rooftop. The message was polite, precisely worded, and communicated without room for interpretive ambiguity that the Delacroix family had decided to pursue alternative arrangements and wished him well in his future endeavors. Brad read it twice, then a third time. He set the laptop down on the windowsill and looked at the city. The city looked back with complete indifference, as cities do. Jade woke in the apartment on the Upper West Side that she had bought 18 months ago with the commission from her largest account, but deliberately, in her name, without consultation, without the particular dynamic of a man who needed to feel that his approval had been sought and obtained. The morning light came through the east-facing windows in long, clean bars that fell across the wide plank floors and the edge of the bed and the single orchid on the windowsill that she replaced every 3 weeks without fail because she had decided, when she moved in, that she would maintain at least one living thing in the apartment that existed purely for beauty and for no other purpose. She lay still for several minutes, as she always did, running the inventory that had become her morning practice. Body, breath, mind, the quality of the day before her. It was a practice she had developed in the first months after the divorce, when mornings had been the hardest part. when the silence of a space that belonged only to her had felt more like loss than freedom. She had sat with that feeling, in the way that her therapist had taught her to sit with things, without immediately trying to resolve it or explain it or convert it into something more manageable. She had sat with it until it changed, which it eventually had, the way all things eventually change when you stop fighting their current shape. The morning felt clean. She made coffee, stood at the kitchen window in a silk robe, watching the park below organize itself into its morning rhythms. Joggers, dog walkers, the early nannies pushing strollers. The retired man who fed the pigeons every morning at the same bench regardless of the weather. The ordinary, continuous, unspectacular life of a city that does not pause for anything. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from a journalist she occasionally spoke to. 2 messages from colleagues who had apparently already seen something circulating online. A photograph, taken on the terrace the previous evening, that showed Seok-jin at close range and Jade beside him, and the general composition of the moment without capturing its specifics. The caption accompanying the image, in various iterations across various platforms, asked the same question in different vocabularies. Who is the man beside Jade Carter? She did not answer the calls. She wrote a single short response to her communications director, who would handle what needed handling, and then she set the phone face down on the counter and finished her coffee in silence. She was thinking about what Seok-jin had told her once about the nature of power. They had been in Seoul, in the private garden of the Hanamdong property, and she had asked him directly, the way she asked him everything directly, because she had learned that directness was the only language he fully respected. How he had built what he built, without ever appearing to be building it. He had thought about the question for a longer time than he usually thought before answering things. The most effective structures, he had said finally, are the ones that are already complete before anyone realizes they exist. You do not build in front of people. You build in the places they are not looking. And by the time they look, the building is already finished. And what they are seeing is not construction. It is simply the world as it now is. She had understood in that moment that he was talking about far more than organizational architecture. He was talking about something that applied to every domain in which power operated. Business, relationships, identity. The long project of becoming someone that the world cannot easily diminish. She had spent 4 years inside a marriage that had tried to convince her she was unfinished, that she was raw material requiring the refinement of someone else's vision, that her intelligence was acceptable when it served and threatening when it exceeded. She had spent the years since that marriage building, quietly, consistently, in the places no one was watching, until what she had constructed was so thoroughly complete that a man raising his hand on a rooftop could not touch a single load-bearing wall of it. 3 weeks after the gala, the Hargrove Fund filed for regulatory review. The process that followed was neither swift nor dramatic. It was the slow, grinding procedural machinery of financial oversight doing what it does, which is move with the inexorable patience of something that does not need to hurry because time is not its constraint. An analyst at the reviewing agency noted in an internal memo that would later be cited in a summary report that the sequence of investment decisions leading to the fund's collapse showed a pattern that was difficult to attribute to simple mismanagement. The memo used the word orchestrated, and then, in a subsequent draft, replaced it with systematic. The distinction mattered legally. It mattered less practically. Bradley Whitmore III retained 4 lawyers over the following 2 months. He called his father twice, calls that lasted less than 3 minutes each and left him with nothing useful. He left 2 messages for the Delacroix legal team that were not returned. He attended no further social events of the caliber of the Metropolitan Gala because the invitations, without announcement and without explanation, simply stopped arriving. His name was not destroyed. It was something quieter than that. It was set aside. The way a room that was once used regularly gets closed off, the furniture draped in cloth, the light switches left untouched, not because anything dramatic happened there, but because it has become, by degrees, a room that no longer serves any function that anyone needs. Kwon Suk-jin's name appeared in none of it. Of course it didn't. And Jade Simone Carter, who had walked into a room in crimson and walked out of it with her spine straight and her chin level and her hand resting on the arm of a man who understood, without needing to be told, that the most powerful thing he could offer her was not rescue, but witness, launched the global expansion of Carter Branding Group 6 weeks after the gala, with a lead client whose hospitality empire stretched across 4 continents and whose name, on the press release, was listed simply as Arca International Holdings. She sat at the head of the conference table for the launch announcement. Around her, her team, the cameras, the journalists, the questions. Someone asked her, as they always asked her, where the strength came from. She smiled. Not the professional smile. The real one. From knowing exactly who I am, she said. And from never again standing in a room that asks me to pretend otherwise. The cameras clicked, and somewhere across the city, in a hotel room that had stopped feeling temporary and started feeling like the new permanent shape of his life, Bradley Whitmore III read the press release on his laptop, saw the name of the lead client, and understood, finally, completely, and far too late, the full dimensions of what he had walked into on that rooftop. He closed the laptop. He sat with the silence. And the silence, unlike the man himself, had absolutely nothing left to prove.
The problem for many women is continuing to call it love when all it has really brought is doubt, emotional exhaustion, and confusion. And the longer that goes on, the harder it becomes to see how much less than they deserve they have been accepting. If you want to start seeing that more clearly and stop repeating that pattern, I left this next step for you. You can access it through the QR code on the screen, the link in the description, or the pinned comment.
If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your silence for weakness? Someone who confused your grace under pressure for an invitation to push further? Have you ever had to rebuild yourself so completely after someone tried to diminish you that when the moment of reckoning finally came, you didn't even need to raise your voice? And have you ever watched someone powerful choose not to rescue, but simply to witness? To stand beside you and let the truth speak for itself? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet power of becoming who you were always meant to be, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.